Insomniacs Anonymous presents the retelling of true stories collected from the darkest corners of the web. Hell's Waiting Room. During my early 20s, I worked as a meter reader in Iowa City. A meter reader is the person who records how much electricity, gas, or water you've used each month. If your meters are on the inside and you want an accurate bill, a meter reader must enter your home, whether you're there to let them in or not. Just to clarify, we only entered homes if consent was given when the customer first signed up for the service. Customers could also provide us with keys if necessary. Entering a home when the owner isn't present is something I never got used to. No matter how loudly I knocked, I never shook that uneasy feeling that I wasn't welcome. The inside of a home is the ultimate private space. A home's exterior is just the image of ourselves that we project to the rest of the world. But the further you venture inside, the closer you become to truly seeing what kind of person lives there. And if you want the raw, unfiltered truth, look in their basement. I hate basements. I've seen walls that looked like giant, static-filled TV screens until I looked closer and it was roaches scurrying across the white wall. Cobwebs so thick and dusty that it looked like the cotton candy machine exploded at the Spider County Fair. I've seen rats, snakes, feces, weapons, neglected children, abused pets, homeless squatters, massive hoards, bizarre items, drug labs, and even a coffin. There are rational explanations for most of these things, but there was also one basement where what I found was beyond the grasp of logic, and that's what made it so terrifying. It was an old apartment house. From the outside, it looked like every other house on the block. I entered the back door and found myself at the top of a staircase. I ran my hand along the wall until I grazed the light switch. I flipped the switch, but no lights turned on. I wasn't carrying a flashlight. A typical route involved 5 or 6 hours of walking, so I carried as little as possible. Oftentimes, I used a light from my handheld screen, but it would only illuminate whatever was about a foot in front of it. So armed with the world's worst lantern, I made my way down into the darkness. Once at the bottom, I blindly shifted across the room, one baby step at a time, with arms outstretched and head down. I eventually reached the far side of the basement. I shined the dim light from my handheld along the wall and discovered 2 doors. Each door led into its own small room. I chose the door on the right and found the meters in the far corner. As I entered the meter reads, I began hearing noises coming from the other room. Something was moving, and there was whimpering that grew louder the longer I listened. I eventually realized it sounded like a dog, sounding weak and distressed. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. At this point, the dog was scratching on the other side of the door. I felt helpless. I reported it when I got back to the office, but I couldn't shake the thought of that dog. It struck me over the next month until it was time to return. So, there I was, 1 month later, back in that basement. At least this time I knew where the meters were. I shuffled back to the little room on the right, while keeping my eyes and ears open for any sounds coming from the other room. This time, I heard nothing. I read the meters and started making my way back, but I couldn't shake the memory of that dog. Was it still trapped inside the room? My curiosity got the better of me. I stood outside the door for a few moments, listening. Nothing. That's when I made a huge mistake. I tried to open the door. I had no more than jiggled the knob when I first heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling screams, unlike anything I've ever heard, sounds that I didn't think a human was capable of producing. Short, piercing, high-pitched shrieks followed abruptly by a low, drawn-out, guttural moan that ultimately morphed into something that I can only describe as crying, but much louder. It was all over the place, like some sort of psychotic freeform jazz. I stumbled backwards, nearly losing my balance. I shouted something like, "Hello, who's there?" There was no response, just screams. I said, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Still no response, just screams. I started yelling loud enough for them to hear me. They didn't want my help. They wanted me gone. I fumbled my way through the darkened room toward the exit. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stood there listening. I was trying to wrap my mind around what I was hearing. I waited for the scream to stop, but it never did. When I finally left, it was still as loud and demented as when it began. I felt relieved, but that quickly vanished when I realized I had to do it all over again next month. I reported what I'd heard, but nothing came of it. As my return drew nearer, a sense of dread grew inside of me. What kind of lunatic sits alone in total darkness and silence? My mind created endless explanations for what kind of hell laid beyond that door. By the time I returned, I'd built it up in my mind so much that anything less than the devil himself would have been a letdown. But there was no sign of him the next month, or even the next several months. I'd nearly given up on solving the mystery when a stroke of luck pulled me back in. One night, I went to a concert with my friend Lara. After the show, I gave her a ride home. She'd moved somewhat recently, so she had to give me directions. I didn't pay much attention to where she was leading me until she pointed to a house ways up the street. I couldn't believe it. She had moved into the house with the mysterious room in the basement. "This sounds weird," I said, "but have you noticed anything odd about the basement at this?" I began to ask. But before I could finish my sentence, she blurted out, "A crazy guy lives down there." Finally, I had confirmation. She went on to tell me that, even though her apartment was in the attic, she often heard him yelling late at night. But that wasn't all. She had actually met him. One day, while walking to her car, she saw him standing in the lawn. He stood perfectly still, with no expression on his face. He was directly in her path, so she cautiously made her way around him. She noticed he was staring at her, so she offered a friendly "hi" as she passed. He had no reaction except for one unsettling exception. He stuck out his tongue, then quickly sucked it back into his mouth and resumed acting like a statue. Thoroughly creeped out, she got in her car and drove away. 2 or 3 months later, I finally met him myself. I entered the back door like I had many months before. This time, something was different. There was a light on in the basement. I peered down the staircase. At the bottom, a ragged-looking dog was staring back at me. It was the same dog I'd heard during my first visit. Then I noticed something else. Behind the dog, I could see a pair of bare feet. The ceiling blocked my view of the rest of whoever was down there, but it didn't matter. I knew it was him. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I know this probably doesn't make sense, but at this point, my desire to finally get some answers outweighed my fear. I shakily called out, "Meter reader," and started making my descent. As I made my way down, more of him was revealed. He looked to be middle-aged, his head was shaved, and his eyes were wild. He was wearing pants, but no shirt. What I remember most was how lean and sinewy his body looked. It had the look of a body that was never at rest. I explained who I was and what I was doing there. To my surprise, not only did he talk to me, but he actually sounded somewhat normal. The volume and pitch of his voice was odd, but he said the same sorts of things people typically say to meter readers. I even started to doubt whether or not he was the same man I'd heard screaming, but his behavior slowly removed all doubt. As I read the meters, he rapidly paced back and forth. He was constantly wringing his hands together and spasmically cocking his head from side to side. The longer he talked, the more agitated he became. He began grimacing, and little verbal tics started popping up in his speech. Every so often, he'd blurt out aloud, "Ugh," in the middle of a sentence. He was trying to suppress these sounds, but he was losing the battle. As I started to make my way to the exit, he followed. His verbal outbursts grew louder and more frequent. I was petrified. When I reached the stairs, I drew our conversation to an end and said goodbye. As I turned to head up the staircase, he could no longer hold it in. Screams. The very same unforgettable screams that I'd heard coming from the locked room. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me, flung the door open, and rushed back into the daylight. A month or two later, I had a couple friends, including Lara, over to my place. I was excited to tell her about my encounter, but as I was relaying what happened, I could tell something else was on her mind. When I finished telling my story, she told me about something she'd seen a couple weeks earlier. One day, she noticed lights flashing outside her window. She later found out from another tenant that he had attacked someone with a knife. That was the last we ever saw of him. I don't know what became of the man in the basement. I like to think he got the help he needed, but maybe that's because I'd rather not think about the alternative. I was the railroad killer's one who got away. I was 19, staying late at the college darkroom to develop some film for my photography class. The photography building, once a tobacco warehouse, was a dark, rickety hulk near some lonely railroad tracks, a little-travelled part of our campus. I finished developing my film close to midnight and headed out, nervous as always to be alone at night in this deserted part of town. It was dark. Several of the street lights around the parking lot were out, and the few that remained were phoning it in, putting out a weak, flickery light that did nothing to reassure me as I headed toward my car. I heard him before I saw him. A scrape of feet on asphalt. He said, "Hey, can you do me a favor?" I startled and dropped my keys, and he mumbled an apology for scaring me. I noticed he was wearing a jogging suit and limping. "What do you need?" I said. He hobbled a step or two toward me. "I think I sprained my ankle. Could you take me to the ER?" I hesitated. The guy looked perfectly pleasant, and he did seem to be in pain. But I'd recently finished a book about serial killer Ted Bundy, who lured some of his victims by pretending to have a broken arm and asking for their help carrying books to his car. When they leaned over to put his stuff in the passenger seat of his VW Bug, he knocked them unconscious with a crowbar and stuffed them inside. This scene played out across my mind as I looked at the guy. Why the hell would anyone want to jog in this creepy part of town? "I'm sorry, I can't do that, but I could call somebody for you. There's a phone in the photography building there." "There's nobody to call. I just moved here. I don't really know anybody. Can't you just drive me?" "I'll call you an ambulance," I offered. "No, I can't afford that. I don't have health insurance. Can't you just drive me? I'll pay you $20. There was something in the way he said the last bit. Something wrong. There was a tone rising up that didn't quite match the words he was saying. A raw urgency that reached down inside me and hit me in the panic button hard. There was a moment of silence between us. "I can't help you," I said. "I'm leaving." I gripped my keys, slipping them between my fingers the way my mum had taught me, so I could use them as a weapon if he came at me. I kept my eyes on him as I speed-walked the last few feet to my car. He watched me drive away, a flat expression on his face. Away from the dark parking lot, driving through campus with my music turned up, the fear faded. I started to feel a little guilty for leaving the guy there, although I knew I'd done what my mum and dad would have wanted me to do. I was about to turn into my dorm parking lot when I realized I needed to pick up some stuff for breakfast the next morning, so I turned around and headed back in the direction I'd come. About a minute down the road, my stomach clenched. There was the guy in the jogging suit, running along the sidewalk. His ankle was perfectly fine. Later that summer, 2 students at my college were attacked by those same railroad tracks. The girl survived, but her boyfriend died. The man who attacked them was a serial killer dubbed the Railroad Killer by police. He'd murdered dozens of people across several states, most of them near railroad tracks. I didn't see his mugshot on TV till years later, but the pictures broke me out in the same icy sweat I felt when I saw the guy running down the street. I can't be 100% positive, but my gut tells me I escaped a serial killer that night. No good deed goes unpunished. This happened in the fall of 1993. I was 20 years old. This was before I started college. I was working the night shift in a plastic factory. I was the only woman in the department, and my male co-workers were initially skeptical that I could handle the job. Eventually I proved myself and earned their respect. It was hard work, but on the plus side, it also put me in the best shape of my life. It was about this time that I dumped my abusive boyfriend. He was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive, as well as an alcoholic. This fact, more than anything, is probably why I got myself in this situation in the first place. I had just gotten off work and it was about 1:30 a.m. My car was running on fumes, so I stopped at a local gas station to fill up. While I was pumping gas, a woman about my age approached me, looking nervous and scared. She said that she'd been at her boyfriend's house, but they'd had a fight. She'd walked to the gas station to use the payphone and call a friend to pick her up. On the way to the station, a car pulled up as she was walking, and the guys inside started catcalling and harassing her. With a slight movement of her head, she indicated a car that was parked off to the side by the gas station dumpsters. I saw a large, light green car, like a Caddy or a Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 shadowy figures inside. She said they threatened her, and that she was too scared to call her friend and wait. The woman was neat, well-dressed, and didn't seem high or drunk or anything like that. She just seemed really nervous and freaked out, so I didn't even hesitate. I finished pumping my gas and told her to hop in the car. I'd take her home. At that time, on a weeknight, there was little traffic, so I booked it right out of the gas station and asked her where she lived. She kept twisting around in the seat to see if the car was behind us, and when I asked her to put her seatbelt on, she ignored me and kept looking for the car. I assumed she was just scared. A few blocks down the road, however, I noticed she was looking around the car, and she started asking me about money. "Where's your purse? Where's your bag? I need money. You need to give me some money." My stomach sank. I have this woman in my car, and now she's going to rob me. But when I thought about it, robbery just didn't make much sense. I was driving in an '85 Chevette, and was wearing my work clothes, a ratty t-shirt and jeans with combat boots. I did not look like a person with a lot of cash, primarily because I wasn't a person with a lot of cash. She twisted around in the seat again and started yelling. "There they are! There they are!" She didn't sound scared anymore. I checked the rear view, and sure enough, the light green car is right behind me. She started cackling and bouncing up and down in the seat. "My boys are gonna mess you up. They're gonna mess you up." She's laughing like crazy, going through the glove box, looking in the back for my possessions, telling me all this messed up stuff these guys are going to do to me. Now, if I had been smart, I would have just driven to a police station. Actually, if I had been very smart, I would have called the cops from the gas station and waited with her until they arrived. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. Unfortunately, none of this crossed my mind until later. In the moment, I just got really, really angry. I realized 3 things all at once. There was an intersection up ahead with cars on either side waiting to cross. The light had just turned yellow. I had a spare box cutter that I kept for work in the driver's side door compartment. The crazy woman still hadn't put her seatbelt on. I didn't think. I just floored it and passed under the yellow light as it turned red. I glanced back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic at the intersection had started to move, and they hadn't caught up. The woman started yelling. I slammed on the brakes, and she hit the dash and the windshield with a solid and viciously satisfying crack. When she rebounded to the passenger seat, I had the box cutter in her face and was screaming some seriously crazy stuff. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of, Get out of my car before I cut your face and make you eat it." The crazy screaming and box cutter combo worked. She grabbed blindly at the handle and popped open the door, and I started shoving and punching her until she tumbled out the door to the curb. I stomped on the gas, got to the next turn, and squealed around it with the passenger door still wide open. I made a few more turns because I was afraid that the green car might catch up to me. After a while, I stopped to close the door, and then cut across town, got onto the highway to go home. I was on the highway for about 5 minutes before the shakes started. I pulled off the shoulder to calm down and get my stuff together. Then I finished driving home. I told my sister, whom I was temporarily living with, everything that happened. She wrapped me in a tight hug, while yelling about how stupid I was for not going to the police. I've never been so glad to be yelled at in all my life. He had plans for me. Yesterday, I was at my sister's house with my mum, watching my son and nephews play in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off a tree when I remembered an odd encounter I had as a kid. I said out loud, "It's so weird," thinking about the encounter. My mum inquired as to what I was talking about, so I told her. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at the pinecone forest. This was what the neighborhood kids called a small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off one of the trees to pass some time, waiting for my friend Frankie to come out and play. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a guy came up to me. I could smell him before I saw him. He smelled like stale cigarette smoke. I was kind of scared when I looked at him. He wasn't very old, but he had a very lazy eye that was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mum had taught me to be nice to people, even if they don't look like me, so I faked a smile and said, "Hello." "What are you doing?" he asked me. The smell of his breath was the worst. Picking bark off this tree?" "You shouldn't do that. It's like picking the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?" he said, while lightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow nails. "I don't know," I replied, and took my arm back. Just then Frankie's mum called for me out her front door and told me to come and wait inside. I didn't think anything of it at all at the time. When I told my mum about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe? She said that it was probably time I know the whole story. She thought I'd forgot about the encounter, so she never brought it up to me. First, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in was a small, tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and there was no reason for an outsider to come, unless they knew someone there. Anyway, here's what happened with this guy. Frankie's mum, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. How cliché, right? She didn't recognize it, but figured maybe it was a visitor for the neighborhood. Sonia said, or rather told the police, that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of keeping an eye on it, she said. She just had a bad feeling. Her house had a huge window in the front facing the pinecone forest, and the van was parked next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept an eye on me and the van while holding a phone, just in case. That's when she saw the man exit the back of the van and walk up to me. As soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops. The cops stopped this guy just outside of the neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at school, at my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mum. Just me, everywhere I went. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him. Inside the unit they found a cabinet full of knives. A lot of knives. Paring knives, a butcher's cleaver, a thin flay knife, and just various knives of all shapes and sizes. There were also a few anatomy books, obstetrical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was an old bed that had been used to restrain mental patients. It had wrist and ankle straps, and the entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrap. To top it all off, my mum said that they kept him in a high-security institution, the last she heard. Bicycle Boy. Several years ago, I was in a bit of a financial pickle. I was 21, with a crappy job history, a crappy job, and crappy credit. Kinda like most 21-year-olds. My living situation went sideways, and I had temporarily moved back home with my folks. As anyone who has ever had to move back home as an adult will tell you, this was a terrible situation, and I was in a rush to get back out on my own, which is why, when my best friend, in a similar position in life at the time, told me that an apartment had opened up in a shady apartment complex, I actually jumped at it. If you're from around here, then you'd know that every apartment complex in town is pretty shady. But for those of you not from around here, this place is a shady non-town outside of another non-town with more liquor stores than any other establishment and several apartment complexes with no credit checks and same-day move-ins. A couple of months went by, and while the cops did occasionally show up and you had to watch your step for more than one broken bottle, it actually wasn't the worst place to live. I worked a night shift at a large retailer, shuffling around freight in the back, hating every minute of every shift. So one night, while I trudged up and down a ladder like a zombie at work, my cell phone fell out of my back pocket at the top of the ladder. I grabbed at it, missing, and died a little as I saw it smack on the ground and go black. No amount of restarting or shaking could fix it. The screen was completely broken. Damn, I thought to myself, and decided this was good enough reason to go home mid-shift. Driving home at 3 a.m. on a random weekday, I turned onto a dark back road that led to my apartment building. I saw something faintly up ahead in the road and immediately thought it was somebody's dog. And what I saw was a teenage boy laying on the side of the road, waving. There was a bike laying in the dirt next to him. Holy hell! The kid saw me and jumped up, weaving towards the driver's side of my car. Now, I may have made a lot of poor decisions in my life, but thankfully I hadn't gone completely brain dead. I suddenly thought of all the warnings to young women about how serial killers would lure girls into their cars by playing to their kind hearts. I locked the doors, but cracked the driver's side window. Are you okay? What happened? Let me get you some help. I got hit by a car and they left me. The kid looked dazed and was scuffed up, but something about him set my nerves on edge. I'm going to call for help, okay? I grabbed my cell phone, and then remembered that it was basically useless. My cell phone's broke, but I live nearby here. I'll go get help. I hoped he didn't think I was lying, but by then I didn't care. The kid slammed his hand against my car. Just let me in, I need help now. I promise I will get help and come back. Everything will be okay. I felt torn. I wasn't going to let this kid into my car, but at the same time, I couldn't blame him. If I was scared and hurt, I would probably be frantic too. The kid slammed his hand against the car again, and I started driving. I hadn't been exaggerating. It was a 30-second drive to my apartment, and I didn't have a landline, and I didn't want to somehow lead this kid into my empty apartment with no way of calling for help. I saw my best friend's boyfriend's car parked in her spot, and immediately was thankful for the stroke of luck. I ran upstairs to her apartment and began knocking on the door. Roy, the boyfriend, answered the door, probably expecting a crazy person, and was immediately even more alarmed to see me. What's going on? Why aren't you at work? I breathlessly explained that some kid had been hit by a car off the road, and my phone wasn't working, and that I needed him to come back with me. Melanie, my best friend, emerged from her room, sleepy and equally confused. Roy immediately took charge, told both of us to get into his car, and drove us back to the boy. The kid was still there, waving us down. Roy, a very large man, Mel, and myself all got out of the car. Help! I need help! I'm here to help. My friend saw you and came and got me. Okay? Calm down. I got jumped by this gang. They beat me up and stole my backpack and rode off, the kid said frantically. I immediately became alarmed. That's not what he told me at all. I looked at Mel, my face clouding over. I thought you got hit by a car. Why did a gang jump you? What? Yeah, they beat me up and then somebody hit me with a car. Plausible. I was still confused though. Roy seemed wary of this change of story. "Listen, man, let me call an ambulance, okay? Tell me your name." Now the kid lost it. He screwed his face up and clenched his fists, hitting the side of his head. "No, no, no, no! Just let me in the car! Take me to your house!" Roy was done. "That's not happening, kid. I'll call an ambulance and the police, and I can wait with you till I get here, but we can't bring you back with us." The kid slapped himself on the side of the head more, and then, in the most disturbing thing I've ever seen, grabbed fistfuls of his shaggy hair and began ripping it out of his scalp. That sound is still the most disgusting and alarming thing I've ever heard. Roy gave Mel and I a "get the hell out of here" face, and we jumped back in the car. "I'm calling the police, okay? I'll tell them you've been hurt and you need an ambulance." Roy began dialing, and the kid began stomping around and screaming. "Take me to your house, just let me in that car. Why won't you take me home?" The kid stood in the street, blood trickling from where he'd torn up his scalp. Roy got back in the driver's seat and spoke with the cops about the kid. The kid then came to the window, staring so intently at us that I felt like my skin had shriveled up and fallen off. He began kicking the tires. Roy, clearly over it, drove off. The kid grabbed frantically at the car. Roy drove past our turn and around Peters Creek twice to avoid letting the kid see where the apartment complex was, then drove back down the road towards the kid. The kid and the bike were gone. No idea where to, but his clumps of hair were still on the road. We never did see the kid again. We searched the papers and the internet to see if anything had been reported, but nothing ever showed up. What confuses me most about it still is why would he demand to come back with all three of us? One person perhaps he could have taken, but what the hell were his plans for all three? Well, that's all for this episode. I look forward to the next one.